all there to be listened to hundreds of times. Okay, so I'll begin with Octavius Cato here. Laid out the... So, part one, stain of slavery to Dred. Now, we can talk about the worst and the less bad aspects of slavery in Pennsylvania. The worst, we might say, by the 1750s, more than 2/3 of Philadelphia artisans employ slaves. That sounds pretty damning, doesn't it? The wealthiest 10% of whites own 44% of slaves, and that wealthiest 10% in the North tend to be proto-industrial producers and craftsmen, which is radically different to the South, where the wealthiest 10% are your planters, people who own big plantations deriving their wealth from agriculture. So at a very early stage, there's a split between sort of proto-industrialist, urbanized wealth in the North, particularly Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, versus in the South, where the wealth is in the hands of the planters, of those people who own large agricultural farms. In 1790, there are some 3,737 enslaved people in Pennsylvania, which might sound like a lot, but at the same time in Mississippi, for example, there are, that we know of, 400,000 and probably something closer to 500,000. So similarly sized places. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 3,700. The state of Mississippi, 400,000 to 500,000. So keep things in proportion here, right? Pennsylvanians even today like to rest comfortably in the myth that we never had slavery in Pennsylvania, and that this is a Southern problem, and that we are the state more than any other, with Gettysburg and our large industrial and manpower contributions to the Civil War, that we are the state that liberated African Americans from slavery, and therefore were free from the stain of slavery. But even though it may proportionally be less radical than the situation in the South, given the exponentially higher number of slaves in the South, we're still not free of the stain of slavery and the stain of racism in Pennsylvania. When it comes to abolition, in 1775, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society is established, and Pennsylvania, because of its Quaker heritage and the egalitarianism of the Quaker movement, and the ideas associated with that, as Dr. Hall has already told you in an earlier point, Pennsylvania leads the way in abolition. 1780, the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, is the first of its kind in America, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is the first place to abolish slavery. 1788, amendments stamped out amendments to the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery stamp out the practice of rotating slaves into Pennsylvania. The rule was, if you had a slave, if you came from the South to Pennsylvania, after 6 months they begin to accrue certain rights. And so right on the border with the South, there's a problem with Southerners coming into Pennsylvania, say for work, trade, bringing slaves with them, and then rotating them back out of the Commonwealth and exchanging them for different slaves so that those people never accrue rights. That's stamped out with an amendment in 1788. The Underground Railroad is the popular term for social networks of abolitionists from the North, aiding and abetting slaves fleeing from the South to find their way across to northern states, and ultimately, after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, to find their way up to Canada, where they can be free of danger of re-enslavement. Pennsylvania is particularly prominent because Pennsylvania sits on what was later referred to as the Mason-Dixon line, which is the division between states in which slavery has been abolished and states in which slavery still exists up until the end of the Civil War. That being Pennsylvania is on the border between the North and the South. Philadelphia, which we'll talk about in detail today, is a real flashpoint of the abolitionist movement, because you might expect that the abolitionist movement might have started in Maine or Massachusetts, or somewhere a long way from the border with the South. but the abolitionist movement's intimately associated with the kind of Quaker-style Protestantism, which just happens to be in Pennsylvania, hard on the border, and Philadelphia in southeast Pennsylvania, straight across the Delaware from Baltimore, is the biggest city in America in the late 18th century, and it's hard on the border. I mean, we're only talking a few miles from areas in Maryland where you have a lot of slaves. And so it's a real flashpoint. And there are a lot of Southerners and people from slave-holding states moving in and out of Philadelphia all the time for business and work reasons. And so it's a place where people are particularly acutely aware of the social differences between Philadelphia, where you have really quite prominent and wealthy citizens of the city who are black, and just south, if you're down in West Virginia or Maryland or any of these places, where blacks have virtually, or have no rights at all, really. So, from 1776, free blacks are citizens with all the same rights as whites in Pennsylvania. Now, there is de facto discrimination in terms of blacks being casually not welcome in certain establishments. There's always this kind of grassroots racism out there, but in terms of the law, there is equality, and that exists up until 1838. And in 1838, the Commonwealth is busily preparing a new constitution for the state of Pennsylvania, and against the backdrop of the growing divide between an abolitionist North and a slaveholding South, the government of Pennsylvania is consciously aware that Philadelphia is this flashpoint, that Pennsylvania is becoming this flashpoint. And so they decide to, unwisely, I think really, to de-escalate the situation by stripping African Americans in Pennsylvania of the vote, which is pretty shocking because they'd always had the vote, free Africans in African Americans in Pennsylvania. But this means that it was thought to, on one hand, disincentivized fleeing fugitive slaves from coming into Pennsylvania from the South. It was thought to kind of pander to sort of Southern criticisms, that it was going to sort of make things all a bit more peaceable on the border. Ultimately, that doesn't happen, as I'll take us through in a bit here. Now, I've sort of pinned this part of the lecture on James Forten, a very famous Philadelphian. Forten was one of Philadelphia's wealthy elite. He's a sailor. Eventually, he manages to accrue enough money to buy a sail loft where they make sails for ships. Keep in mind, Pennsylvania is losing its population supremacy to New York City by this period in the 1830s, but it's still one of the biggest ports on the East Coast, and so he becomes very wealthy as a sail maker. This is still in the age of sail, before steamships have become real common. He writes a text called Letters from a Man of Color in 1813. It's published anonymously, but everybody knows who's written it, and it doesn't take but a couple of years before he begins publicly acknowledging that he'd written it. Philadelphia had become a major destination for fugitive slaves, and the Commonwealth considered, this is in 1813, so this is, we're over 20 years before the sort of shameful stripping of the vote from African Americans. The Commonwealth had considered an act that would make incoming blacks from the South register that they were living in Pennsylvania. On the one hand, this was going to give them a sense of the scale of immigration of fleeing slaves from the South. On the other hand, it was perceived as being almost a kind of register, so that if you were a Southern slaveholder and you turned up in Philadelphia and you wanted to know if your ex-slave was there to be chased down, shackled, and taken south again, you could check the register and see their name was on it. So it's pretty outrageous, and Forten says this is the thin edge of the wedge of discrimination. Pennsylvania is unique in the sense that, you know, free blacks in Pennsylvania have always been able to vote. They've had equal rights, essentially. This is a thin edge of the wedge of discrimination. He speaks out against that. And his pamphlet helps kill the slave bill. What are you consulting on up there, ladies? Did you just Google Forten or something?
No, she's just asking questions.
I was really hoping it was going to be course related, and I could be like, what have you found?
It was course related.
Oh, really? What was it?
Do you mean they allowed Southerners to chase slaves north? If the slaves had run away to the north, that they're allowed to go chase them again?
This is contentious. They do so without firm legal basis, but they do so. They come north because these individuals consider property, they have cash value, right? Eventually, in 1850, the United States government, which of course comprised representatives from North and South, passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which makes it legally sanctioned to come to the North and to track down your runaway slaves and take them to the South again. It also imposes a $1,000 fine and other penalties on Northerners who help aid and abet fleeing slaves in the North. And this is really the point, in 1850s, the point at which the quote-unquote Underground Railroad becomes underground, because until then, de facto, particularly Quaker communities in the North, were very happy to help, or felt morally obliged to help. Okay, the 1873, sorry, try that again. The 1793 U.S. Fugitive Slave Act allows Southerners to chase enslaved persons north and find Pennsylvanians who helped them. God, dude, did I get that wrong? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, isn't it? The Fugitive Slave Act backs this up, basically, strengthens this with more severe penalties. I think with the Fugitive Slave Act, you can actually be imprisoned for helping blacks in the North. Sorry, I'm standing in front of 1793 and telling you 1850, but there is a further Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Where are we at here? Fortin spoke out against the American Colonization Society, which was a movement at the time popularized in the North, which favored shipping people of African descent back to Africa. They thought that was the best thing for them. So this is a kind of soft racism. Oh yes, we're anti-slavery, but now that we've liberated all of these enslaved individuals, we really ought to send them back to the place where their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather came from, because of course they'll fit right in there. There is, in fact, a substantial body of former slaves and free blacks from the North who do go to Africa and help colonize Sierra Leone and Liberia. And in fact, Liberia, which has a flag, which is a variant of the United States flag, has a ruling elite of descendants of former slaves with English surnames, which of course they got from their slave owners in the US, even until today. So they're kind of ruling caste in Liberia, and this is a contentious point. But of course, that's a country that's seen a lot of civil war and dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship. And so some people say the US needs to take responsibility for the de facto colony they created in Liberia. The US government has always washed its hands of it, saying Liberia was a private enterprise intended to help African Americans, supported by a lot of prominent African Americans. But Fortin, he spoke out against this, saying, why should we have to go to a place because of the color of our skin when we have no social or cultural knowledge of that place? Fortin worked with Richard Allen, who founds the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, a very famous building, it still exists, which is the first black denomination church, because in the course of slavery, strangely in this kind of southern paternalistic way, they thought they were doing their slaves a favor by converting them to Christianity from those terrible traditional religions they had, although they didn't then let them go. What they did was they focused on converting them to Christianity and teaching them particularly the Old Testament story of either the Babylonian captivity when the elite of Israel are taken to Babylon, or more prominently still, the stories of Moses and how the Jewish people of the Old Testament were slaves in Egypt. And basically saying, don't worry, your day will come someday, but no time soon. And so there's a certain kind of irony there. But this evolves into a particular kind of Protestantism in African American communities, which lives on to this day, which is focused very much on singing hymns relating to the Old Testament, focusing on the stories of slavery and liberation in the Old Testament, and so forth. Okay. Here's a fabulous building constructed in Philadelphia called Pennsylvania Hall. Between 1837 to 1838, a so-called constitutional convention was held to reform the Commonwealth Constitution of Pennsylvania. This was really formed to discuss issues of tax and representation. These are always the two sticking points, tax and representation. But a petition of Philadelphians, and people always say here, I think Pennsylvania is trying to divert blame, say, oh, this includes the signatures of thousands of Southerners resident in Philadelphia for various reasons, is sent off to the Constitutional Convention saying, we need to diffuse this slavery issue by stripping African Americans in Pennsylvania of the right to vote. On 17 January 1838, the Constitutional Convention agrees this and is written into the 1838 Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Now, this in response leads to the so-called appeal of 40,000 citizens, which is similarly sent off to the Commonwealth government. And this says, among other things, not only have 40,000 citizens of Pennsylvania object to this, which is more than were signatories to the original Philadelphia petition, but Pennsylvania includes at that time, this is a kind of census figure here, 18,768 blacks paying $1,350,000 in taxes annually. And so, if people are paying taxes, they have to be represented. Think about the American Revolution, the battle cry there, no taxation without representation. These people are paying an awful lot in taxes. Very wealthy Pennsylvanians like Fortin pay thousands of taxes every year. If you're charging them taxes, you have to give them representation. Now, the Abolitionist Society in Pennsylvania sets up a public subscription, raises over $20,000 and builds this grand hall in Philadelphia called Pennsylvania Hall. And it's in Pennsylvania Hall just after the law has changed to strip Africans of the vote. It's in the hall that the appeal of 40,000 is presented. So, I point out here also, I should have mentioned on that previous slide, was a cover of a newspaper called The Liberator. A white Protestant chap named William Lloyd Garrison works together with Fortin, who Fortin funds him, to set up a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, which is an abolitionist movement newspaper. Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society is established in 1838 against the backdrop of stripping African Americans of the vote in Pennsylvania. The society builds Pennsylvania Hall, which I just showed you a picture of, beautiful building. They use a joint stock company, over 2,000 shares at $20 a piece is sold. Local black and white craftsmen contribute free labor to build the hall itself. This all sounds like a wonderful thing. It's dedicated on 14 May 1338. The first thing they do there is read out the petition of 40,000 against stripping African Americans of the vote. And a series of speakers come, but also letters are sent in by prominent persons, including former President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, who writes, I think rather wonderfully here, I learned with great satisfaction that the Pennsylvania Hall Association have erected a large building in your city wherein liberty and equality of civil rights can be freely discussed and the evils of slavery fearlessly portrayed. I rejoice that in the city of Philadelphia, the Friends of Free Discussion have erected a hall for its unrestrained exercise. That sounds wonderful, doesn't it? 15 May, Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women meet there. This is black and white women meeting together. 16 May, by evening time, abolitionists Garrison, from up above, and important female abolitionist, Mary Weston Chapman, they address a sold-out crowd of 3,000 in the audience with the firebrand speeches denouncing slavery in the South. 17 May, the Women's Committee meets again, black and white women together, but an angry mob, which Some historians say it's principally comprised of Southerners who have come in the city. An angry mob forms outside. The building manager gets afraid. He goes to the mayor of Philadelphia, locks up the building, hands the keys to the mayor of Philadelphia and says, I wash my hands of it. It's now your responsibility as mayor to take care of the situation. But alas, in the evening of 17 May, the mayor, after he cancels all future events out of fear of an increasingly large mob, the next thing he hears about are fire bells being rung because people have broken in, opened the gas taps with gaslighting at this time, and lit the building on fire. Here it is 3 days after its opening. What a terrible shame. And I would recommend this excellent book, which I found very useful preparing this lecture. For example, the Oxford University Press, Pennsylvania Hall, a legal lynching in the shadow of the Liberty Bell. It's just quite firebrand in itself. So you can see the way Philadelphia is this incredible flashpoint. It's on the border between North and South. It's a major city. So how do African Americans in Pennsylvania get the vote back? We associate this with Octavius Cato. So if we think about William Forton as the man of the age when the vote is stripped, it's Octavius Cato as the man of the when suffrage is restored. Pennsylvania's own intellectual civil war is going on between 1838 and the end of the Civil War. So this is an intellectual war between pro-abolitionists and milder anti-abolitionists, those who think that freed blacks ought to be able to make a life in Pennsylvania, and those who think they ought to be shipped back to Africa. So there's a huge intellectual war going on in Philadelphia. Overall, the Quaker state, though, is an anti-slavery stronghold. It is the state most associated with the Underground Railroad to smuggle out fleeing slaves. Philadelphia is effectively the front line in this intellectual war. W.O. Garrison, who publishes that newspaper, The Liberator, financed with Forton's money, he becomes one of Frederick Douglass's first friends when Frederick Douglass comes north. Frederick Douglass is a man who escaped slavery, comes north, writes all kinds of anti-slavery literature. He settles in New York City. He travels in France and in Britain, speaking out against the ills of slavery. Google him, you'll find a million things about Frederick Douglass. He's a kind of poster child for strong, charismatic black man speaking out against slavery before its formal abolition. However, things aren't really going Pennsylvania's way on a national basis. The Dred Scott versus Sanford is a decision taken by the United States Supreme Court in 1857. So we have the kind of Fugitive Slave Act is tested in 1857 when Scott, who is a slave who has been brought north by his master, essentially flees the authorities and tries to sue for his freedom. The U.S. Supreme Court, which is stacked at this time with the majority of occupants of the bench of the U.S. Supreme Court are Democrats. Democrats are universally Southern Democrats who are all pro-slavery. And so divided on party lines, you get a majority decision where all of the Democrats in the vote on the bench say a black person cannot be a citizen. The Republicans on the bench say a black person can be a citizen, and it's on this party line divide that the United States Supreme Court decides, and I quote here, a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the U.S. and sold as slaves, end quote, can never be a citizen. This made unassailable the position of the 1838 Pennsylvania Constitution, which had stripped black Pennsylvanians to vote. However, of course, in the between 1857 and 1863, we have the outbreak of the Civil War, one of the main causes of which is this question of abolition and slavery. And we see Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. The U.S. Civil Rights Act is passed, the first U.S. Civil Rights Act is passed on 9 April 1866. Granting equality of process under the law. Keep in mind that's different from freeing people, saying that they have equality of legal process. The 14th Amendment offers equal protection under the law. It's ratified by all states by 9 July 1868, and it's the basis of most civil rights legislation through the rest of the 20th century, 19th, 20th century, i.e. Brown versus Board of Education, the famous decision which says that separate but equal is okay. It all hangs on the question of, is separate but equal really equal? And at that time they decided it is, but that's later overturned, of course, in the Civil Rights Movement. Keep in mind the 13th Amendment frees the slaves. The 14th Amendment offers equal protection to people no matter what their race or creed. That's the language of the amendment there. 15th Amendment restores voting rights to all persons, all male persons, irrespective of race. And so that restores voting rights to black Pennsylvanians. Now, here's Octavius Cato, a man who's born of free parents. He's of free ancestry here. He's freeborn in Charleston, Carolina. He studies classics at the Quaker-backed Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Keep in mind, Quakers are a big driving force of abolition. He becomes a teacher. He's a charismatic public speaker. He endorses the creation of colored units in 1863. Sorry, a little typo there. It should be 1863, 36. And he speaks at the Philadelphia National Hall, a kind of de facto replacement for the old burnt-down Philadelphia Hall. And he's celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. The proclamation came on January 1st, and there's celebrations in National Hall on January 2nd. He's considered, in a way, the voice of the city, in a way that Fortin had been before him. He's chosen to present the first regimental flag of the first of the colored regiments before in Pennsylvania to Lieutenant Colonel Tripp of the 24th U.S. Colored Troops. And of course, the leader of these colored regiments is a white officer. That's all the further we've gotten in terms of civil rights, but nonetheless, he's the man who presents the colors. He pioneered desegregation and civil obedience on Philadelphia trolley cars, which in 1867 were formally desegregated, but as you well have read, of course, there's a big court case arises from the enforcing desegregation. Long before Rosa Parks dared to sit in the front of a bus, a black woman dared to sit in a Philadelphia trolley car. I would put it to you that it's this Southern focus narrative of the Civil Rights Movement that has led to focus on Rosa Parks. 18 October 1871, the black vote is formally restored in Pennsylvania. Black Republicans and Irish Catholic Democrats then clash in riots around voting stations. Voting stations in Philadelphia when black men try and exercise the right to vote for the first time since 1838. It's the same thing. We have the kind of so-called what's it called? The Red Riots in New York City, where African Americans in New York City and Irish Catholic Democratic immigrants riot there too, because these are the two groups at the bottom of the labor pool. So the manual labor for unskilled workers, the manual jobs go either to African Americans or they go to Irish. These are the two biggest groups late 19th century, right? And so of course they're in direct competition with one another, and politically the Irish Catholics are all Democrats and the blacks are all Republicans, and so they feel if one group or the other votes, then they'll lose their representation locally, etc., 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 right? So there are riots on 10 October 1871. Irishman Frank Kelly shoots Octavius Cato 3 times. It's a contemporary illustration. Cato knew his life was in danger. He went on that morning and bought a pistol because he feared that he might be attacked on the way to the polling station. And so he takes some verbal abuse when at the polling station. He gets to the street corner here. They've kindly put it in here. It's in reverse. I think this image has been reversed here. It's on the corner of South Street, Lombard Street in Philly. An altercation arises, and by all accounts, Kelly drew first and shot Cato 3 times.